Welcome to Research Data Management webinar. I am Wael Khadr, Research Knowledge Manager at Qatar National Research Fund, and I will be your host. Also, we are very pleased to have Dr. Arif from Qatar National Research Library. He will give us this presentation of today. Before I leave the mic to him to present himself and take us through his presentation, I want to remind all of you, the presentation will be recorded and will be available for future reference at QNRF YouTube channel. Okay, Dr. Arif, please go ahead.
Thank you, Wael. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Arif Shawan. Hang on. I thought you had the slides. Bear with me a moment then.
Should I share it?
No, that's okay. I've got this too. So, share my screen quickly. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Go to presenting mode.
Go into the presentation mode there. Oops, not
yes.
The last slide. Sorry,
Perfect.
those are the last slides. Just go to the first one. Okay, here we are. All right. Okay, good morning again. My name is Arif Shawan. I work at the Qatar National Library as a Senior Digital Curation Specialist. And today I'm going to talk about some of the best practices for managing the research data that you will be producing or generating as part of your QNRF funded projects, including the projects that are under the NPRP program. And those of you who attended the 2019 edition of this webinar, so we did one similar to this one back in 2019, will find some of the things that I'll be talking about are still the same or very similar to what I discussed back then, because the best practices haven't changed significantly in the last 2 years during the pandemic. So it's just a sort of a reminder of what we talked about there. And in addition to that, I just want to make just to ensure that we're on the same page. The aim of this webinar is not to sort of dictate or sort of tell you how to do things. You may already be doing. You may already have practice of research data management incorporated within your research project. And if that is the case, then it should the purpose of the webinar is to sort of give you a reassurance of the good work that you're doing. But if you're not quite if you haven't quite incorporated the best practices, then hopefully this will either help you do that or help you give you a bit of a motivation to do adjust your data management practices. So that is just that is the one of the main goals of this webinar. Another very important aim of this webinar is to sort of introduce you to some of the new requirements of QNRF in relation to data management and data management planning more specifically. So we'll go into that during the course of that webinar. So hopefully at the end of this webinar you'll be better prepared for meeting those requirements, or at least you'll be better informed. So here's some of the things I'd like to cover over the course of this webinar. So as usual, we'll start with a bit of a reminder of the importance of research data as valuable scholarly resources in their own right. And then we'll go into the actual management aspect of that. Then we'll talk about the planning part of the data management. Then I'll introduce you to the change, the new requirements of QNRF in terms of submitting a research data management plan, followed by how to sort of report on the progress that you will have made and the guidelines and the support that's available. And then I'll leave you with some concluding remarks and some key messages, and hopefully we can have some discussions around that as well. And of course, at any point during the course of this webinar, if something doesn't make sense or doesn't sound right, please do stop me so I can address any concerns or queries that you may have. So hopefully that's clear. So we'll go to the first section, which is basically just to remind ourselves of the importance of research data as valuable resources in their own right. But before I do that, let's just try and confirm our understanding of what research data really means. And depending on the discipline that you're coming from, it may mean different things to you. But in general, research data really refers to all types of information, regardless of its form or the way you're presenting it, that you would need to support or validate the claims or the conclusions that you'll be drawing at the end of your project. So you have a research question to begin with, then you work throughout your project to find an answer to that question. So the data that research data is essentially the key evidence to support that answer or the conclusions that you'll be making. So just to kind of give you a few examples, depending on the discipline that you're coming from, the research data could, it comes in various shapes and forms. It ranges from, for instance, images, videos, description of instruments or measurements, to something more as complex as the measurements that you'll be taking in the field. For example, if you're doing field work, or if you're in the geospatial domain, then you may be taking measurements or readings of certain natural phenomena at a certain geographical location. So the data resulting from that would be part of the information resulting from that would be part of your research data. And of course, in social sciences or digital humanities, the research data would be the results of the survey that you undertake, and so on. So hopefully that's given you an kind of an overview of what types, what research data really sort of looks like. Now let's talk about the importance of research data. And as you may be aware that in the last decade or so, and I think it's a little bit more than now, that there's been increasing awareness of the importance of research data as valuable resources in their own right. So research data are increasingly being seen as first-class citizens rather than rather than supplementary information to support the claims or the conclusions that you're making in your traditional publications. So beyond just an adjunct to the traditional publications, the researchers, the wider research communities are seeing the potential benefits of research data in both academic and commercial contexts. So just to kind of give you an understanding of what it means is that if you have good quality research data and it's shared in a certain way, whether in a traditional publishing context or or made accessible to researchers beyond your own research group, then it has the potential to be useful in another research project. So it can be reused to produce new science, new discoveries, and so on. So another research group can take your research data and build on it, and perhaps find new things and help find answers to new research questions. It also provides sort of new avenues for getting attributions and citations. As you know, in the research domain, that is the currency for either progress in your career or sort of as part of your key performance indicators. So getting citations and attributions through research data is definitely one of the key benefits of having good quality research data that's either published or shared in some way or form. And in many cases, and perhaps more importantly, research data is what you need, good quality research data, along with the sufficient contextual information about how you've produced the data, what methodologies you use to actually arrive at the data, is very crucial for validating the claims, the scientific claims or the discoveries or the conclusions that you're talking about in your publications. So it helps you reproduce in a way. It can help you reenact the research workflows to validate the claims, the research claims, or the discoveries you're making. So these are essentially three sort of broad categories of benefits or the usefulness of good quality research data. And there's a few evidences sort of over the last few years. Back in 2009. there was a review of the UK eScience program, which termed data as the new instruments of science. And then a year later, and this is probably one of my favorite examples, and I mentioned that during the 2019 edition of this webinar as well, that this is often referred to as the Climategate Incident, where the emails of group of very prominent and respected scientists, climate scientists at the University of East Anglia in the UK were hacked into, which led to serious question marks raised over the integrity and the quality of their research. And as you know, that the data from their research is used by UK Met Office and other sort of various weather-related sort of services around the UK and perhaps even beyond. So these questions were obviously quite serious, which led to serious allegations. And eventually they were cleared by very heavily publicized investigations by the UK House of Commons, but it did raise, or rather underline, the importance of having good quality research data along with granular information about how the research was conducted, including information about the interim data results, the research methodologies, the different decisions that may have been made at various sort of stages of the research life cycle. So this was a bit of an eye opener for the wider research communities in the UK and beyond about the importance of research data, as valuable resources in their own right, beyond just an adjunct to the publications that it often sort of supports or underpins. There's another example. So, sort of 4 years later, Nature, as you know, is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, opened up a new branch just for publishing research data. So it enables publishing just research data. You don't need to publish a full paper or anything like that. So you can publish your research data as long as it's it's accompanied with sufficient contextual information, i.e. metadata, then you get the same level of attribution that you would get from a traditional publication. And more recently, as you may be aware, Research Data Alliance, has been making a lot of headways in terms of making data, research data more open and shareable and more. And this really sort of further emphasizes the published worthiness of research data in their own right, and in sort of further emphasizing the importance of it all. So hopefully that's given you an overview of the importance or reminded you of the importance of research data as sort of very valuable scholarly outputs. Now let's talk about what it takes to actually have good quality research data, which is basically research data management. So I've highlighted the 3 key benefits of having good quality research data, but to have that, you need to do a little bit more work, which is where the notion of research data management comes into play. So all of it is basically requires sort of a continuous activities of planning, storage, and of course and preservation of it all, basically. So in general, you need planning, curation, and preservation. I'll unpack what curation and the terms curation and preservation really imply in this context and in a few slides. But in general, data management, it entails a series of continuous activities, not just as a one-off at the very beginning of the project, but as a sort of a throughout the life cycle, to ensure that the data that you have at the end is of good quality. Just to kind of give you a bit more sort of understanding of what it means. So if you look at a research data life cycle, and depending on your discipline, you'd probably have you probably either use existing data source from a data cataloger, for example. That's definitely the case for example, the climate science domain, where you have a catalog of data that already exists over the web. That you use that, and then you process it in a certain way to ensure that it's aligned with the research workflow that you have put in place. Then you apply your methodologies, your computational models, to analyze the data further. Then you arrive at your conclusions, your final data results. You preserve it or store it, archive it, and then you make it accessible either to your institution or a broader group of users. And of course, this is where some of the legal and ethical considerations will come into play. I'll talk about that in a few slides. But the idea is that once the data is accessed, you then either yourself you use it in a continuation of your current research project, or another group of researchers take it up and then use it in their project, and they go through the same life cycle essentially. And when you look at the different stages, you have the data in different stages. You often have the raw data that you either collect from your instruments or for perhaps another source. Then you have your process data. Then you apply your research methodologies to it, whether you run computation models or so on. Then you get your analyzer drive data, that you get your final data set. And all of these different types of data need to be managed. So that is the point of it all, basically, is that you need to look after these data at various stages of its life cycle to ensure that ensure sustained accessibility and reuse over and beyond the project life cycle. And that is what the research data management is about. And it goes without saying that to do this all efficiently, you need to plan it. You need to plan it well. And in fact, it applies to any aspects of your life. If you want to do something well, if you do something good, then you have to plan it so you have a better chance of achieving the desired result. And there's a bit of a quote for you here: for each minute of planning at the beginning of a project, you will save 10 minutes of headache later. I'm not sure exactly whether it will be 10 minutes of headache, but you may end up saving some headache. So it's definitely to plan ahead. Then sort of trying to finding yourselves in a bit of a pickle later on. So that is the point of that. And what does it? So if you think you've managed your data well, then what should the final outcome look like? How do you know that you managed your data well? So you need a way to assess the quality of the data at the end of the project, or at any sort of at given time within your project lifecycle. And there are ways to help you with that. And one such way is the fair data principles. So in a nutshell, the fair data principles provide you with sort of 4 different criteria against which your data quality can be assessed. The first of which is ask the question, is your data findable? So can people find your data? And some of the things to consider under that is whether your data is identifiable in a persistent and consistent manner, whether there is whether there is enough metadata surrounding it, whether you've described your data well, not just the data but the contextual information, the provenance, the research methodologies, and so on. And then can you find it on the web? These days findable often implies in most cases implies that can you find it through web-based technologies. And that is the first category against which you can actually measure the quality of your data. Then once you found it, can you access it? And this is where some of the the IP and copyright related considerations come into play, because it's very important from a user point of view to understand the conditions governing the access and reuse or the use of the data before they can actually access it. So in case of QNRF, for many QNRF funded projects that have commercial prospects, you may not be able to make the data accessible immediately. So there's often a certain embargo period that's imposed on the data before the data can be made accessible to a wider audience. So those are things that you need to consider. But the idea is that your data is accessible at some point, and the access conditions are clear to a prospective user. So once the data is accessible, then can the user use it within their research workflows? So their research workflows may be different from the research workflows that you have. They may have fully automated sort of systems in place, which only deal with human readable information and so on. So you need to ensure that the data are interoperable. So you can measure the interoperability of the data in terms of the data formats that are used, the languages that you're using to describe both the data and the underlying metadata as well. And finally, once a user has found your data, accessed it, and deemed its interoperability, can they actually reuse it in their research project? Do they have enough information to understand, the type of the research you've done, how you've done it, your research methodologies, and form their own understanding and plan of it so that they can actually use it in their research project. So these are the 4 different sort of criteria against which you can measure the quality of your research data. And you can find more information about it, later on. We'll talk about the guidelines that we produced along with in collaboration with QNRF, and that gives you more information about how to sort of get into some of the details of it all. Okay, so now we understand hopefully we understand the importance of research data as valuable resources in their own right. We understand what it takes, or at least the notion of what it takes to actually produce good quality metadata and how to possibly measure the quality. But then let's try and remind ourselves what are what would happen if we actually don't do it, don't do any of this. So if you don't manage your data well, what are the potential risks that we may have to tackle with? And some of these are pretty obvious no-brainers. If you lose your data, for instance, in a QNRF-funded projects, that if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have access to the data at the end of your project, then you will probably fail to meet one of QNRF requirements, which is to provide evidence of either the data being stored in a trusted repository or the existence of the data. So that could then have further repercussions in terms of your future funding and so on. So as you can imagine, it ranges from that to being, to a loss of reputation as an individual researcher. As you know, that is an important currency in the research world, and which is often tied to the institutional reputation as well. So there's quite a few serious risks to consider when it comes to managing your data. So it should be within your interest to manage your data well, so that you don't find yourself in these scenarios at the end of at any point during the life cycle of your research project. And there's a link to this sort of diagram, this image where you can find more information about these risks. I'm not going to go into that any details here. So now we understand the risks. Now let's talk about the planning. As I mentioned before, that to manage your data well, you have to plan it. And this is where the notion of research data management plan sort of comes into play. And it's often referred to as RDMP or DMP, and different variations of that. But in general, what it means is that you have to have a plan at the beginning, and not just a one-off. And this is something you need to have a plan to record what you're going to do, and later on you need to update it as you're making progress. So what should you expect to see in a good research data management plan? You should expect to see a wide variety of information, ranging from information about the data that you'll be producing, because at the beginning you may not have the data. As you often start with a research question, which leads to production or generation of the data. So at the beginning you have you may not have the data, but you need to think about what type of data you'll be creating, either creating or sourcing or procuring from somewhere, and then how you'll be analyzing it. So you need to talk about the research data methodologies that you are planning to use within your project. Okay, and this may well change. As you make progress within your project, this may well change. You may have to adjust your course of action, your research strategy as you're going along. But this, at the beginning, you're planning that this is how you're going to do the work. Then you also need to think about how you're storing the data, and you're backing up and so on. We'll go into more of that in a bit. But often is the case that it's more important to think about the ethical and the legal considerations of how your research data will be used and stored, especially when you're dealing with data of sensitive nature or data involving human and animal participants, and so on. So we'll go into more of that in a few slides. But in a nutshell, these are the types of information that you should expect to see in a good research data management plan. But one of the wider objectives of this plan is that, beyond just to sort of help you plan your research data management well, but also to sort of, help you think about the users of the data. Because, if you're a prominent researcher, if you've been in the game for long, then, you may be juggling multiple research projects. You have deadlines to meet. You have milestones to achieve. So you often lose sight of how the data will be used, by the users, whether it's the current generations of users or the future generations of users, and how the research will be used to further science, to help facilitate new discoveries. So this planning, in a way, is designed or intended to help you change your perspective from being a data producer, which is what you are when you're undertaking research, to the perspective of a data user or even a reuser. So there's some of the things that to consider here is that, you often think about restoring the data, but when you're planning it, you probably be thinking a little bit more than that, beyond storing. So you think about archiving and preserving it. Then from the preservation or the archival data archival, you'd probably go beyond that and think about how to make the data findable, and from findable to accessible, and so on. So the idea is that while you're planning it, as part of the planning process, your perspective will change from being a data producer to data user. So you can put yourself into the shoes of a data user and really think about, okay, I'm doing this work as part of this research project, but then what I'm doing, what I'm generating, what I'm producing, how will it be used by other people, other research projects, for example. So hopefully, so that is the intended sort of one of the wider objectives of having a plan in place, and having that plan updated more regularly through the life cycle of your research project. So what you end up having is a living document. So the plan becomes a living document as you update it, which is what you update throughout the life cycle of the research project. And this is actually a very valuable source of information when it comes to, preparing your data, the final data at the end of your research project, because it provides you with a lot of the metadata that you will need, at the end of your project. And in fact, there's many institutions in the UK, US, and Australia. They provide platforms where you can not only manage, create plans for your research data management plans, but also it provides you with the ability to extract, important metadata from your plans and import into your final metadata record that you will accompany your final research data. So this is really a valuable source of information for your final, preparation of your data set, or even for final reporting. That you'll find a lot of the information is already in it, so you can just reuse it as needed. But that's why it needs to be a living document. It needs to be updated as you make progress in your research project. So the funding bodies around the world recognize the importance of both the research data management and the planning aspect of it. And as you may be aware, that the funding bodies in the UK, US, and even Australia and in Europe, they now require research data management plans to be submitted along with their funding proposal. I know in UK and Australia, on USA, it's now a mandate. It's a mandatory requirement. In Australia, I think it's recommended. It's a recommendation. I'm not sure if it's become a mandate yet, but in general, it's expected that a research data management plan will be submitted along with a funding proposal. So as a sort of a key requirement for that proposal to be considered. QNRF recognizes that the same importance, and has been working with QNL, Qatar National Library, for quite some time. Once again, those of you who attended the 2019 edition of the webinar, this was mentioned as well. The library signed an MOU with QNRF to work together to incorporate good practice of research data management within the QNRF project lifecycle, which led to the development of the QNRF data management plan policy that was published in the early parts of 2019. And now more recently, we, together we've made some more progress, and which in the form of, introducing a data management plan, or rather incorporating data management plan into the NPRP project lifecycle. And if I'm not mistaken, you will be required to provide a data management plan, submit a data management plan during the pre-funding stage. Well, do correct me if I'm wrong. And then later on, you will be required to provide a report on the progress that you will have made during on the plan itself. So these are your new requirements that you have to become familiar with. And in the next few slides, we'll go into the details about how to what to expect in those templates, and how to prepare that. But just to kind of help you acquaint with the location, the web page where you can actually find all this information, I'm just going to get out of this slide quickly and just show you where you can find this type of information. So if you just Google data management plan, QNRF data management plan, you should end up on this page here. Hopefully you can see this. And on the right hand side, you have the links to all the important things that you need. So you have the plan policy there, and then you have the template. This is the template that I'll be sort of walking you through in the next slides. But this is what you need to submit a data management plan during the pre-fund stage, if I'm not mistaken. And then later on, you will then need to use this template, data management progress report, to provide a report on the progress that you will have made on the plans that you had submitted during the pre-fund stage. And to help you all of that, QNRF have produced these guidelines in collaboration with QNL, which is an assortment of all the best practices that you can find, best practices related to research data management that you can find if you rummage through the web. But this is to kind of help you sort of consolidate all of that and make it more relevant and pertinent to the QNRF funded projects. So hopefully you can remember that. We'll come back to this in a bit, but let's just go back to the presentation. So in the data management plan template, what you will find is 4 different topics or 4 different categories of information that you are asked to provide. And these are basically, there are questions under each of this category that you need to provide answers to. Once again, at the very beginning, you may not have all the answers, and that's absolutely fine. But this helps you think about what you might be doing, how you would be sort of dealing with the issues or the topics that are basically being mentioned in these different categories. So let's take a look at the first one, which is about data collection and documentation. So it's really the first questions are about your data, what type of data you will be generating, or either procuring from another source. It asks you a question about if you're actually going to be using a third-party source or existing source. Then it goes into some of the technical details of the data, including the structure of it. How are you going to structure the data? How are you going to name the folders and the files, and so on? How are you going to handle the versioning if you're going to be using different versions of the data? And there's more there's detailed information about the practices around it in the research data management guidelines, specifically under section 4.1. And once again, as I said, these are just guidelines. They may not be directly relevant to what you're doing. So if you already have, so for instance, if you're naming your folder in a certain way, and that's already the community standard or the norm, that you may want to just stick with that. But this is to kind of alert you of the different options, essentially, which would help you with the data organization and so on. So the first set of questions are about these. Then it asks you a question about your research workflow. So this helps you think about how you're going to actually conduct your research from a more pragmatic standpoint. So you ask the question about, what methodology you're going to be using. If you're going to be using something already exists within your community, or you're going to be developing something new. You're planning to develop a new software, to manipulate the data or something. So it helps you think about these things. Once again, the answers may not need to be very detailed, because you may not have the detail at the very beginning, but it helps you think about those questions and provide as much information as possible at this stage. And you'll have the opportunity to update these questions, answers to the question at a later stage when you provide, a progress report, or will be expected to provide a progress report. And then the third set of questions within this category is the metadata, which is basically asking a question about, how you're going to capture your metadata, what type of standards you'll be using, how you're going to do the documentation, how you're going to ensure the accuracy and the quality of it all, and so on. The overall objective is this type of information is to make you aware of the importance of the documentation, because when you're undertaking your research, everything is clear to you. Perhaps not at the beginning, but as you make more progress, it's clear to you. But is it going to be clear to another group of researchers? So it kind of takes you back to the question, the wider objective or the wider purpose of research data management. It helps you think about the user of the data. Will it be meaningful to them? So what's obvious now, what obvious to you now, might not be obvious in a few years or few months, or future generations of users. So documentation, having clear and detailed documentation would definitely help with that. There's sort of further motivations about being as detailed as possible in terms of documenting your research methods. It also helps your work to be reproducible, and of course, having enough detail, sufficient detail about your research methodologies and the workflows would be useful for verifying your scientific claims as well. But in a nutshell, it comes down to a few different few things that you consider when it comes to documentation, and that applies to any type of documentation. Essentially, you should be clear, concise, consistent, accurate, and sometimes you have to conform to a certain structure. I mean, this even applies to the final report that you'll be submitting to QNRF, because QNRF has a certain structure that you have to follow for producing that document, producing that report. You have to provide accurate information. You have to be clear about what about the reports that you are submitting and so on. But I suppose the most important message here is that if you're not documenting enough, then you should probably do more than what you're already doing. But do something at least. No documentation means that there is no chance of your research being understood by the future generations of users, because essentially that's what that's what your ultimate goal is. Through your research, you're trying to solve a problem for humanity, and making the world, I don't mean to sound dramatic, but making the world a better place for not just current generations of users, but also for the future generation of users. So documenting your research and your data will give them a better chance of understanding what you've done, and perhaps build on that. So do something. It's better to do something than nothing at all. So that's the message here, and you can find more information about it in the guidelines. Now, the second group of information is about the ethical and the legal considerations you have to make when you're planning your research project and subsequently producing data and dealing with it. And it asks a series of questions about the ownership of the data, who owns the data, and this can be quite a complex question to answer when you have multiple collaborators. You might even have an industry partner, but you should also but this is something you need to be mindful of. Who owns the data? Where does the institutional ownership fit into all of that? As a funding body, where does QNRF sit in all of that, and so on. And this is also very important when you're exploring commercial opportunities for your data as well, or your research outputs. And then it asks questions about, how you're going to protect the identity of human participants if your data involves human participants. How you're going to deal with sensitive data to ensure that, it's stored and transferred securely. So it also ties into the storage aspect of it, which I'll come into a bit after a couple of slides. And of course, when you're dealing with human participants, have you, you need to think about the way you would gain consent. And to sort of for not just for sharing the data, but also for storing and preserving it. And of course, there may be some very complex licensing considerations to make as well when it comes to enabling reuse of the data. And this is where you need to be mindful of some of the established QNRF protocols. So as you may be aware, the IDKT is essentially responsible for managing all aspects of IPRs generated by QNRF projects, and this is something you need to be aware of. And in a way, this kind of helps you, think about, or helps you seek out information about established QNRF protocols that you may not be aware of. So by doing this, by answering these questions, you'd be able to sort of seek out more information about any sort of QNRF protocols that you need to adhere to. So this is definitely a good practice, at least for that purpose. So kind of I'll ask you a series of questions regarding your ethical legal considerations, and there are more information about it in the guidelines and any related QNRF supporting documents that you can find on the QNRF website. So that is the second group of category of information or the questions that you have to answer. As I said, just with the first category of questions, you may not have all the answers at this stage, and that's absolutely fine. You provide as much information as you can, and then later on you can update that during the progress report and so on. Okay, the third type of the category of questions that are asked of you in the template. It's about the data sharing, how you're going to share your data, how you're going to store it, how you're going to preserve it. And there is a distinction between storage and preservation that then I'll go into details about in a minute. So first is about data sharing. So and this is where some of the ethical and legal considerations will also be very applicable. So who are you going to share the data with during and after the project? So if you have external collaborators, then how are you going to share the data in a secure and safe way? And if you're dealing with sensitive data, you're dealing with data that contains human participants information and so on. Do you need to do anything extra before you share that information with an external collaborator? Do you need to redact some of the information before you can share that with an external collaborator? How would you do that? The technicality of it all. If you're using an institutional data storage, how would you give access to that to an external collaborator? So all these questions are being asked to help you think about how you're going to manage that. And once again, you may not have all the information at the beginning, but that's absolutely fine. But at least it helps you prepare for that. And then from the sharing, you have the as I said, access and security. So how do you ensure the security of the data when it comes to sharing the data with an external collaborator, or even after you've completed your project and the data set is now finalized, but there may be access restrictions placed on it before the data can be shared in its entirety. Perhaps the data can never be shared in entirety. Maybe only the metadata will be published, and then the data will always remain behind a certain security layer, and the user will need to go through a certain channels and adhere to certain protocols before they can actually access the data. So all these things that you need to consider during planning stages, and once again, you may not have the information at that stage, but you'll have an opportunity to update that at a later stage. And after that, you think about the storage. So and this is where you have to be very strategic, because you may not have the budget or the financial resources to keep all the data of all the data. So we have a question. Sorry, we have a question in the chat. Is it okay if I take that at the end of the presentation, or is it important to understand it now?
I think let's keep the Q&A to the end of the session.
Okay, all right. So we'll come back to you, Elizabeth. Just bear with us. So just back to the storage. As I was saying, is that you may not be able to keep everything, although everything may be very important to you. But even though the storage capacity is definitely a lot more than what it was back 10 or 20 years ago, but you still need to be strategic about what you're going to actually keep, both during and after the completion of the project. So the question is about do you have sufficient storage? But there's also an important sort of consideration to be made when it comes to dealing with active and sort of final data set, basically. So it is important to understand the difference between active data and the final data results. So do you keep it both, or do you just keep the final data and part of the active data? Now, by active data, what I mean is that the data that you're working on during the life cycle of your project, the data that are not final, you may have some dead ends or some inconclusive results, and then you change the course of your research, then you end up producing something else. In many cases, these data may not be as important as the final data result, but in other cases, they may be equally as important as the final data results for providing a clear account of the research that you've undertaken. So it depending on your discipline and your research, type of the research you're doing, this is something you need to think about. Do I keep it all, or do I just keep the final data results and perhaps enough information about the interim data results, but not the actual interim data results? And do I have enough storage about that? And there's some financial considerations to be made too. And the bigger question is that whatever you end up keeping, will it be enough to facilitate reproducibility of your research? So that is something to take into account as well. So and once again, you may not have answered the question, a detailed answer to the question at the very beginning, but this is something. This should help you think about that and perhaps plan for that in a more efficient way. Now, and this is just a slide to just sort of drive the point home that there are many cases of young researchers or emerging researchers or PhD students having their data on some USB stick or some external hard drive that they end up losing at a train station. I mean, which is probably not very applicable to Qatar because most people here drive. Although we see an increase in the number of people using the public transport, the metro. But anyway, so there are in other countries, you may end up losing all of this. So there are a lot of if you look up on the web, you'll find a lot of horror stories of data being lost and so on. So it's definitely important to think about where you will keep the data in terms of both during and after the completion of the project. Another thing to consider is your data may often have some geographical restrictions imposed on it. So if you happen to be working in a project where there's a clear restrictions that the data that you produce cannot go beyond the geographical boundary of Qatar, then you have to find a storage that is basically hosted and based in Qatar. So even though you may have access to various cloud-based storage such as Dropbox, Google Docs and so on, but none of these really guarantee that the data will remain in Qatar. In fact, in case of Dropbox, as far as I know, doesn't even have any data center in Qatar. So the moment you upload your data there, it will be somewhere in Western Europe or perhaps in the US. So these are some things to consider when it comes to storing your data. Now the final thing is about the in relation to storage is preservation, which is not the same as storage, and it's very important to understand the fundamental differences between data storage, or sometimes which is referred to as backup, and digital preservation. Digital preservation is essentially it's a series of continuous activities or operations, if you will, and some of them are preemptive and some of them are reactive, that basically ensure that your data, along with the metadata that describe it, remain discoverable, accessible, usable on contemporary, computer technology. and over the long term, for a long time. So essentially, it ensures the longevity of your data. So which is more than just keeping the data on some place and making sure it's always there. But just backing up the data doesn't mean it's being preserved. It doesn't guarantee that your data will be accessible or even usable to a future generations of users. And a classic example would be, let's just say, if you're a seasoned researcher who's been in the game for 20, 25 years, then you must have done your PhD perhaps 20, 25 years ago, maybe in 1995, and you must have written your PhD on I don't know, using WordPerfect, for example. And let's just say you kept your thesis file, written your PhD thesis, and you've kept your thesis file safe and sound, and you've moved from one storage to another. Okay, but it's still in WordPerfect format. If you try to open that file in, for example, Microsoft Word 2000 and whatever that is right now, there's a good chance that you will probably fail. Even if it ends up opening it, you may not see all the information that you had in there. Maybe some of the diagrams will be missing and so on. So that is an example of data being backed up properly and securely, but not being preserved. Because if you had preserved it, then what you would have done probably is that you would have migrated your thesis file from WordPerfect to Windows 98, whatever the Office 98 version of that, and so on and so forth. So today you'd actually be able to open the file and read it. And this problem gets further complicated when you're dealing with complex data, especially if perhaps domain-specific data or the data that have proprietary formats, or the formats that are all very very specific to a particular community and so on. So you can keep a copy of it, the underlying bits and bytes, safe and secure for a long time, but it doesn't guarantee that data will be accessible and usable over the long term. So preservation is essentially a strategy to help you tackle the challenges of rapid evolutions in computer technology, so that your data can survive the test of time and remain accessible and usable. And this is where, as a responsible researchers, it's important to understand the difference between the data backup or storage and preservation. And having this plan kind of helps you think along those lines. And as some specific considerations to be made is, I already alluded to the data file format that you're using. So when you're choosing a file format, it's important to choose a file format that is widely used. Not just something that's very specific or very niche in your community. So it's better to use something that is that is more durable, that has a wider community behind it for the purpose of preservation as well. So there's more detailed information about it in the Research Data Management Plan, the section 5.2 in Research Data Management Plan and Guidelines. And this is just that's a slide to kind of make the point about the data format, the slow death of data. So if you happen to have your data on a floppy disk or even a zip drive, you'd be hard pressed to find a computer device today with a built-in any of these the devices or even drivers. You can probably find one on Amazon, but then there's a whole lot of challenges associated with that as well. So that's just the point of that, is that be strategic when it comes to choosing your data format for the purpose of preservation and data longevity. Okay, so the final group of the category of information is about who's going to do all of that, who's going to look after your data, who's going to take the responsibility to actually undertake all these different activities that you need to do to manage your data well, so you have a good chance of having good quality data at the end of your project. And what are the costs involved? There may be financial resources you would need. You probably need some technical resources as well. So this question helps you think about that, and perhaps helps you prepare helps you to be better prepared when you have to have that conversation with your IT department. So if you're thinking about it at the very beginning of your project, then you're better prepared for it, so you can have a productive conversation in your IT department to find a solution that works, for both your institution and yourself. So that is essentially the goal of this. And let's take a quick look at an example, data management plan, which is actually in the Appendix B, or is it A, of the guidelines document. Just bear with me a moment. So if you go to the guidelines and you go all the way to the end, and there's an example of what a data management plan would look like. This may not be applicable to your domain, but this is not meant to be a sort of a sample or representative of any of the domain. But this is sort of this is intended to give you an idea as to what kind of information that you might want to put in there. I mean, I've already gone through that in terms of the questions that are being asked, but just to give you a feel for the answers that you might want to put in there. So first one is about data description. Here, the researcher is basically talking about their laboratory experiments. They're also mentioning the type of the volume of the data they're expected to produce, and this doesn't have to be absolutely accurate at this stage. As I said, you can come back and later on update it. Then when it comes to the methodology, once again, this may not be directly relevant to your domain, but here there's a discussion around the laboratory experiments, how they're doing it, field experiment, if it happens to be a field experiment, then what they're planning to do, and so on. And if they're using any established sort of practices, then there's also reference to that as well. And when it comes to documentation and metadata, here there's a mention of a metadata standard that this research is planning to use. In this case, they're using Data Documentation Initiative because that is a well-known metadata standard for capturing granular information about scientific studies. Once again, it may not be relevant to your domain, so you have to choose something that's relevant. And the ethical and legal considerations, at an initial stage, as you can see, the answer is rather thin, but it does give indication of the researcher's thought process around these considerations. So it says the project will collect data from human participants, hence it will follow the QNR guidelines for ethical compliance, and so on. So and then as you can see that there's a question about data sharing and the storage, the data retention as well, and so on. So this is just to kind of give you a feel for. I mean, this is all already on the web. Please feel free to kind of take a look at that and see if that's useful to you. But this is just to kind of give you a feel for the types of answers that you can provide. It doesn't need to be in a very structured way. You can provide as much detail as possible. Okay, so back to the slides here, and then the progress report, which has the same structure as the actual plan, because you're essentially talking about the same things, but it asks you to provide an update on how you will have gone about executing your plan, whether you've changed the course of your action, whether you've adjusted your plans, and are there any further considerations to be made, and so on. So this essentially is asking you to provide an update, provide a progress report on the progress that you've made. Just that. It doesn't ask you any new questions. It's the same sort of questions that you asked at the planning stage. These are just updates to those answers if you have any. So and then finally, it's as I said, the next steps for your project will be to actually prepare and submit one of these data management plans, depending on the NPRP that you're part of, and you will be you will receive further information about the way to submit the plan and when to do it from QNRF. So please watch out for that information in due course, and then you'll be expected to report on that as well. So the time frame of that and the protocol, that all of that all that information will be shared with you in due course. And at the end, there is an expectation of you to actually prepare and submit, store your research data in a trusted repository, and hopefully the planning for that will help you prepare for that as well. But idea is that you submit your data, you store your data in a trusted repository, not just some good cloud-based storage such as Dropbox or Google Docs or Google Drives, for example, but choose something. There's a mention of these in the guidelines. So they're usually sort of 2 or 3 types of them. There's the general purpose repositories such as Dataverse, Figshare, But there's also sort of domain-specific data repositories such as Nomad for the material science domain. So choose a repository that is trusted, that actually provides more than just data storage and backup, perhaps preservation as well. And there's a big enough community behind it. And it's also clear that what would happen in the event the owner of the repository or the institution who's managing it sort of terminates its operation. So is there a clear plan for transitioning the data or the transferring the data from that repository to somewhere else? So that is something, those are things you need to take into account, but there's some suggestions and some guidelines in the guidelines document. And on that note, you may be aware that there is, QNRF is in the process of developing a data repository in collaboration with QNL. The planning and the work has been underway for quite some time, but there will be a data repository for you to deposit your QNRF funded data into, and that will be integrated with Qatar National Library's digital preservation system as well. So your data will be digitally preserved. So yeah. So, but the main message here is that the data sets that you have are an important part of your project, the project results, and as far as I understand, the ownership actually lies with Qatar Foundation. But Will can shed more light on that if necessary. But in general, all of these may sound very daunting. The new requirements to follow, the new requirements to meet. There's a lot more work to do, but there's definitely help and support available for you. Hands-on training and guidelines are available online, but and through other channels as well. And if you have any complex licensing and legal questions for the preparation of your data set, there's also consultation service available from both QNRF and QNL. Finally, so as I said, the objective, the wider objective of all of that is to sort of change your perspective from being a data producer to a data user, and treat research data as valuable and potentially reusable resources in their own life. In their own right. And the data management planning is not just a one-off thing. You have to do it if you're doing it, then you have to do it over the course of the life cycle of your project. And there's some really important aspects of the data management that you have to pay particular attention to, including security, documentation of metadata, and legal issues, definitely. And finally, after this webinar or at any point during the life cycle of your project, if you have any questions or advice, please do reach out to either QNRF or QNL, and there will be help and support available for you. Thank you for listening.